When you started playing competitive Pokemon, you probably made progress fairly quickly. Maybe you started by learning what EVs and IVs did, or recreating your in-game team on Pokemon Showdown. Maybe your knowledge of the type chart needed to be refined, but time would fix that problem. I'm sure none of you stayed below 1200s on the ladder for very long. But at some point, your progress likely slowed. You understand the metagame, you're a decent player, and you understand basic game concepts, but no matter how much you play, you seem to be stagnating somewhere in mid-ladder. I'm going to go over the top 5 reasons why you're not getting better as a player in competitive Pokemon. I'll be using examples from SVOU, the main format in competitive singles, but a lot of these principles will apply in other tiers as well as VGC. Let's get right into it. The first reason you may be stagnating is habit playing. Habit playing is very common in mid-ladder. You've learned enough about the game and played enough matches that you know how you should usually handle specific situations. But you go overboard. You take the knowledge of what play is usually correct and you make that play in every situation, regardless of the game state. Let's take a look at an example. Here, you're playing against a Webs team. You lead with your Galarian Slowking into Ribombee, a solid lead, and you get lucky. It's a Bug Buzz Ribombee, not even a Stun Spore. So you finish it off. Your opponent goes into Glimmora next, and you have Psyshock. Then, before going out, the Glimmora hits you with a Meteor Beam. You kill it. But the Roaring Moon comes in. At this point, you switch into Skarmory, as that is your typical Roaring Moon answer, as it Dragon Dances. Now, you body press, but you're not able to kill the Roaring Moon, and it's able to take you out. Now, you don't necessarily lose the game yet. You still have priority in form of Raging Bolt, and the Roaring Moon might not have Roost. You'll probably be okay, at least for a little bit, but this Weavile looks extremely threatening to your team, and you'll probably end up losing to it. Skarmory was your only Weavile answer, but you had to sacrifice it to Roaring Moon, didn't you? Well, that's what a habit player would think, but actually no. Let's take a look here. Here's the same situation you were in before. The Ribombee's dead, the Glimmora has used Meteor Beam, Rocks are up, and Sticky Web is up. Now there's actually a different play you can make here. You can Toxic. Now this seems maybe obvious in retrospect, but think about it from a habit player's perspective, and this may be you in many situations. Switching in Skarmory on Roaring Moon is what you do. That's what you do in these situations. Saving Slowking, especially a Toxic Slowking, when there's a Raging Bolt around, similarly is what you do. But not in this game. Against a team this offensive, realistically, you're not going to be able to get this Slowking up to any point where it'll be able to regen enough health to deal with a Raging Bolt, especially looking at the Pokemon remaining on the team, being Raging Bolt itself, Gholdengo, and Weavile. So, Slowking's health actually doesn't mean much here. It's okay to sack it. If Roaring Moon attacked you, you'd be able to go into Skarmory and easily Iron Defense up, staying super healthy. But if it didn't attack you, you got a Toxic off, and we'll see what happens next. You sack Slowking because you correctly identified it wasn't a big deal. You can go into Skarmory, and because you no longer have to worry about body pressing, you can Roost here, to the point where Knockoff will no longer do significant damage, and your Skarmory will be able to heal to the degree where it can take on a Weavile later. So you see here, although typically when you see a Raging Bolt, preserving a Toxic Glowking is a good idea, and usually you do switch Skarmory into Roaring Moon hard, it's not always the right play. You've got to think through specific situations, and making habit plays like this is going to make you lose a lot of games. There are different degrees of habit playing. The most common and easiest to break is when you only habit play in high-stress situations, like the example we just saw, with a Roaring Moon setting up. It could be you only habit play when faced with threatening sweepers and breakers, but it can be a lot worse. I've seen some players that almost never think through a turn, and they mistake habit playing for intuition. So how do you fix this? As the name habit playing would imply, you've developed a bad habit, and bad habits are notoriously difficult to break. Well, awareness is the first step. If you realize this is you, that's a great start. Make an active effort to consider all your viable plays each turn when you play, and review your replays as well. Check to see if you missed a better option in favor of a more familiar option. If you're struggling to break your habits, think of it this way. On any given turn, you only have 10 possible buttons. 4 moves, 5 switches, and Terra or not. You can probably eliminate 5 or 6 of these options immediately. When you find yourself in a difficult spot, if your timer permits, just think through every option. This will really force you to abandon your habits. The second reason you might be stagnating is not making mid-ground plays. So what is a mid-ground play? It's when you identify all your opponent's likely moves and select an option that covers most or all of them. You can think of this like the opposite of a prediction. A prediction is when you anticipate your opponent to make one specific play and you select the option that punishes that play hardest. A mid-ground may be the hardest punish at times, but typically it just does a good job of covering many of your opponent's likely plays instead of doing a great job covering any particular play. Let's take a look at an example. Suppose you're playing against the famous Probopass hyper-offense team. You have your Samurott in against a Grimmsnarl here. You expect the Grimmsnarl will likely go for a Reflect, and you decide to go for a Ceaseless Edge. This puts you in a good spot, as getting up a Spike is very nice, since this Great Tusk is at the health, first of all, has Assault Vest, so Spike will almost kill it, and you have a Rocky Helmet Landorus, which will, after an attempt to spin or Ice Spinner, the Tusk will die. This means that if you set up any hazards, they're here to stay. Now, you then switch into Raging Bolt, correctly anticipating your opponent will attempt to go into a Weakness Policy Iron Crown, hoping to catch another Dark move from your Samurott. Now, you're in a bit of an interesting position. You could Thunderbolt, but without Light Screen, this Iron Crown is not in a favorable position, and since you didn't show Booster Energy, your opponent probably knows your choice specs. Curem is a very possible switch here. Sinistcha is another possible switch. It would take a Thunderbolt with not too much damage and would be able to potentially start Calm Minding and Strength Sapping up. Your opponent also could go into Great Tusk and absorb the Thunderbolt. If you Draco, you'll one-shot a Curem or Sinistcha switch. So what do you do here? This is a great opportunity to make a mid-ground play. Thunderbolt actually covers a lot of your opponent's options fairly well, and the most disastrous ones are not that big of a deal as long as you click a certain move. If you click Draco, worst case, this Iron Crown starts setting up, and that could be a huge problem. Your opponent could also go into Grimmsnarl, which would be an unexpected play, but Grimmsnarl could come in, set up a light screen, and then you would be in a tough spot there as well. Now, what if you Thunderbolt? Well, it's good against the Iron Crown and Grimmsnarl. If your opponent goes into Tusk, you can just switch Landorus and it'll die next turn, then you'll be free to click Thunderbolt next time. Sinistcha will take enough that you can fairly easily switch out, and you have a Gholdengo that can block Strength Sap, and if Curem comes in, you have a healthy Slowking and a Gholdengo to take it on. So if you really think about it, the only way this goes poorly for you is if this Iron Crown Calm Minds on your Draco Meteor, and Thunderbolt is pretty much a catch-all. So you go for Specs Thunderbolt. Sure enough, it hits the Iron Crown very hard, and after going for a low roll, it does not achieve it, and you get your kill with Thunderbolt. There was no way clicking Thunderbolt worked out poorly for you there. It could have not been ideal, such as a switch to Tusk or Curem, but those were a lot more manageable than had you Draco Meteored into the Iron Crown. That's what it means to make mid-ground plays. Even if you predicted your opponent would go into Sinistcha or Curem, clicking Thunderbolt works in many situations. If you're predicting and going for hard reads most turns, you're not playing optimally. The rush of calling out your opponent and getting a hard read can encourage some people to continue a prediction-heavy playstyle, but trust me, none of the best players try to predict every turn. Generally, the only time you need to go for hard reads is when you have a bad matchup or you're behind in a game and need to fight your way back. Also note that making a mid-ground play doesn't mean doing the same thing every time, even if you're in the exact same situation. It's a good idea to sometimes select an option that covers fewer of your opponent's likely plays, but perhaps punishes those it does cover harder in order to throw your opponent off and avoid becoming too predictable. Mixing in the occasional hard read is rarely a good idea, but if your opponent seems to be calling out too many of your mid-ground plays, a hard read, even if the attempt fails, can shake your opponent and make trying to predict you more difficult. So how do you start making mid-ground plays? In your games, when a turn isn't immediately obvious to you, try to identify what your opponent's likely plays are. There are typically 2 to 3 likely plays on any given turn, but there could be 4 plus, or your opponent may only have 1 likely play. Look at your team and try to identify what covers the most of these plays best. Be creative here. Sometimes mid-grounds aren't immediately obvious, even if they're really great. And if you're struggling to be creative and cover your opponent's options, remember what I said earlier. There are only 10 buttons you could possibly click, and most can be easily eliminated. If you have time, go through them all. It's a great exercise to understand how to think creatively and make good mid-ground plays. The third reason you may be plateauing is if you have trouble understanding your opponent. I just talked about how essential mid-ground plays are to top-level gaming, but what if you can't determine what your opponent's likely plays are? It's impossible to select an option that covers your opponent's likely plays if you don't know. A great way to develop a sense for what your opponent will do is just practice. Lots of time playing on the ladder will certainly give you a sense for what play your opponent will make. That being said, if you particularly struggle with getting inside your opponent's head, there are 2 useful techniques you can use. The first is to identify how much your opponent values their Pokemon. This is a great thing to do at Team Preview. Ask yourself what your opponent has that is good against your team. You don't know their sets, so this isn't a super precise strategy, but you can generally tell which Pokemon your opponent considers valuable and which they don't. This can make identifying likely plays much easier, since your opponent will usually be inclined to preserve their most valuable Pokemon and be more willing to risk and sack their least valuable Pokemon. Let's take a look at an example. Immediately when I was playing this game on Team Preview, I can see, I only have 1 Grass Resist and it's a Dragapult. By far, my opponent's strongest Pokemon here is Rillaboom. So let's play this game and see what happens. Sure enough, Rillaboom starts off. Now here I have a Banded Hoopa, which looks great into my opponent. Now unfortunately this is a Specs Timid Dragapult, so I'm not able to Wisp this, but I could take it out with a Flamethrower or a Draco Meteor, depending on its set. However, I choose to U-turn here. And sure enough, I U-turn out on the Goldengo. Likely my opponent expected a lead Will-O-Wisp Pult and was hoping to absorb it with Goldengo's Good as Gold ability. Now, why did I U-turn here? Well, I knew my opponent really valued their Rillaboom. They didn't want to risk it getting Flamethrowered, Draco Meteored, or Will-O-Wisped turn 1, so they made a switch. This gave me an opportunity to go into Hoopa Unbound, go for a Hyperspace Fury, which the Primarina does not take well at all, and I get a kill. Now unfortunately, my opponent now has another entry point with Rillaboom. I go into my defensive Landorus, which, although it does a lot of damage to the Rillaboom with Recoil and Rocky Helmet, does get outsped and goes down. Now, grassy terrain does run out here. Now this time I go into Samurott. You may be thinking, wow, surely the Rillaboom will switch out again, right? And I can maybe Razor Shell something coming in? That looks good. No, actually, I go for Sucker Punch here. So why would my opponent choose to leave in this Rillaboom? Why did I go for that trade? Why would they not switch it out again? Well, there are a few factors. One is the fact that the Rillaboom is now a lot weaker. Because of how chipped down the Rillaboom was, it was much less of an asset than it was to my opponent at the start of this game. Furthermore, if my opponent let my Samurott start stacking hazards, the Rillaboom would be even weaker. And on top of that, my Hisuian Samurott was a big threat to my opponent as well, so they probably want to get it off the field. After that Primarina died, Hisuian Samurott was very, very threatening for my opponent. So you see, by identifying how much the opponent values their Pokemon and the risks they perceive on your side, you can really tell what they'll be willing to risk, and this can help make it easier to predict. Another strategy is thinking several turns ahead. Ask yourself, what happens to my opponent if I get this play right or wrong? You might think your opponent would never sack something, but what if sacking that certain Pokemon gives them a game-winning setup opportunity? It's much easier and more natural to consider what happens to our own team several turns ahead, but looking just 1 or 2 turns ahead from your opponent perspective can often show you what they're going to do this turn. Suppose your opponent's sacking their only ground type to your Specs Raging Bolt Draco Meteor. Sounds ridiculous, right? Surely they'd never do that, then Volt Switch would be free. Well, what if you being locked into a -2 Draco Meteor, the turn after killing the ground, allows their King Gambit to potentially set up and win the game? Well, then they'll be probably switching in their ground on your Raging Bolt every single time. These are the things that thinking just a few turns ahead reveals. Before we continue, if you're enjoying the video, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. We're so close to 10K, let's make it happen. The fourth reason you may be stagnating is your teams. Now, it's important to be honest with yourself here. Of all 5 reasons in this video, this is the rarest issue to have. Blaming your teams for your poor playing is only going to hinder your progress. I've seen a lot of people chasing the perfect team while ignoring their larger battling strategy problems. That being said, for some people, their teams are legitimately their biggest problem. There are 3 main problems I see people have regarding teams: using generally bad teams, using the same team over and over, and always using the same archetype. Let's address the generally bad teams first. Maybe you have an affinity for a playstyle that's just not viable, like Psy Spam or Electric Terrain. Perhaps you enjoy an unviable Pokemon or two that you put on nearly every team you use. There's nothing wrong with playing for fun, but if you seriously want to improve, you're going to have to use teams that allow you to thrive. You won't get the chance to learn from your mistakes in a game if your team with no Dark Resist gets swept by a Kingambit. Every time you lose to a Kingambit, you'll probably blame your team, and you'd be correct. But if you did have a Dark Resist, say you did have a Great Tusk, maybe you would have allowed it to be weakened and you'd end up getting swept by Kingambit anyway. This could be a learning moment, but you'll be denied the chance to learn if you played poorly or correctly because your team let you down. The solution is fairly simple here. Stop using bad teams. There are a lot of places where you can get good teams. You can ask good players, copy teams from high-level tournament replays, use sample teams, or look on the Rate My Team forum on Smogon, and use teams that have had a lot of success on ladder. With so many options, there's just no way you can't find a good team. Now let's discuss the always using the same team people. It's important to remember that teams don't stay good forever. Pokemon get banned, new trends rise, and the metagame shifts all the time. A team that was good a month ago now might be pretty mediocre. Using the same team over and over because it used to work is a terrible idea, and not just because the team isn't adapting to the metagame. Using just one team makes it much easier for habit playing to take hold as you get more and more used to your team. It can also box you in as a player since you'll only have experience using a few Pokemon in the metagame. Now for the last and most common of the 3, playing only one archetype. A lot of people don't think it's a problem to play one archetype. Some even proudly identify as a hyper-offense player or a balance player. Some people claim that using just one archetype will make you a specialized expert when using teams of that style. This is completely wrong. Always using the same archetype will limit your growth significantly. In Pokemon, every archetype can teach you something. Stall teaches you the best way to respond to threats defensively. Balance teaches you to make progress with offensive Pokemon while also conserving the health of your team. Offense teaches you how to apply and maintain pressure on your opponent, and Hyper Offense teaches you the value of a well-timed sack and the best time to utilize setup. Being a competent offense player will make you a better stall player. Being good at balance will make you better with Hyper Offense teams. The best stall players know when to get aggressive and apply pressure rather than just playing defensively and passively. The best Hyper Offense players know when they can save a Pokemon or answer a threat defensively instead of just making the easy play and sacking. Competence in other archetypes will make you a better player at whatever archetype you prefer, so make sure you branch out. The 5th reason you may be plateauing is that you use too much stall or Hyper Offense. I know I discussed the importance of playing several archetypes in Reason 4, but I see so many newer players gravitate towards these 2 playstyles I want to address it specifically and explain why these 2 are so harmful. But Pinkacross, I reach my highest elo whenever I play stall or Hyper Offense. Yes, I know, this is not a surprise to me. These are by far the easiest archetypes to play in competitive Pokemon. Both have a very flowchart way of playing that requires little thought or variation to achieve pretty decent levels of success. As such, they will limit your growth significantly. Most mid-level stall players have little to no experience in applying offensive pressure to their opponent, an essential skill. As I said earlier, the best stall players are good at applying offensive pressure and identifying the rare situations in which a stall team can and should do it. If you only play stall though, your experience with this will be very, very limited. Similarly with hyper-offense, if this is all you play, you have little to no practice responding to threats defensively. Both playstyles will also have a very consistent game plan regardless of your opponent's playstyle. Suppose your opponent plays very prediction heavy and goes for hard reads. Well, as a hyper-offense team, you'd probably start with your suicide lead, go into whatever sweeper can set up on the Pokemon that's in, and continue doing that for the rest of the game. Similarly, stall will switch in whatever walls the Pokemon that's on the field, try to set up hazards, use status moves, and repeat. What if your opponent is very cautious and makes same plays every turn? You do the same thing, lead with your suicide lead, try to get hazards up if you're playing stall, etc. Now, what if your opponent plays mostly cautious, but starts going for hard reads when the game turns against them? You still do the same thing. You get the idea. Playing only stall or hyper offense removes or greatly diminishes so many competitive aspects of the game. This will really hurt your learning. That's not to say you shouldn't play stall or hyper offense. Especially if you're in the tournament scene, being able to play these two archetypes capably will make you a much scarier player to prepare for. All I'm saying is that if you only play stall and or hyper offense, you're making competitive Pokemon with training wheels, and you won't really learn to ride until you take them off. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'll see you guys next time.